My name is Arthur Sterling. At 71 years old, I've spent my life designing the structural integrity of some of the most prestigious skyscrapers in Manhattan. I know exactly how much pressure a foundation can take before it crumbles. I know how to spot a hairline fracture in a support beam from 50 yards away, but as I pulled my vintage sedan into the manicured driveway of my daughter's estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, I had no idea that the foundation of my own family had already turned to dust. It was a Tuesday, a day of suffocating humidity and deceptive stillness. I had driven up from the city to surprise my daughter, Cassandra, and my wife, Eleanor. Eleanor had been staying there for 10 days, supposedly helping Cassandra through the aftermath of a late-term miscarriage. My wife, the ever-steadfast Eleanor, had sounded brittle on the phone lately, tight, like a wire stretched just past its breaking point. She told me not to come, that Cassandra needed quiet recovery, but 45 years of marriage had taught me that when Eleanor tells me to stay away, it's usually when she needs me most. I was halfway up the bluestone porch steps, a bouquet of Eleanor's favorite peonies in one hand and a bottle of aged scotch for my son-in-law in the other, when the world tilted. A man I'd never spoken to, a solid, silver-haired neighbor I recognized from the house next door, came sprinting across the lawn, his face a mask of raw panic. He was waving his arms, his boots kicking up clods of perfectly manicured turf. "Stop!" he bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar that cut through the afternoon hum. "Don't go in there! I've already called 911! The peonies slipped from my fingers, scattering across the stone. My blood didn't just run cold, it turned to slush. "What are you talking about? That's my daughter's house. My wife is inside." The man reached me, gripping my biceps with a strength that suggested a military past. His name was Garrett Vance, a retired Marine who kept his lawn like a parade ground. His eyes were wide, scanning the windows of the Sterling Vane estate. "I heard it all, sir," Garrett panted, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The windows were cracked open. It started 10 minutes ago. Screaming, not just an argument violence. I heard glass shattering, furniture being hurled against the walls. And then, he swallowed hard, his jaw working. A woman screamed. Not a shout for help, but a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Then it went quiet. Dead quiet. "You can't go in there alone." And Weaken laughed. And Weaken laughed. And Weaken laughed. And Weaken laughed. Weaken laughed. Weaken laughed. I tried to shove past him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Eleanor! Eleanor!" I roared, but Garrett held fast. "The police are seconds away, Mr. Sterling. If you go in there now, you're just another victim." The sirens began as a distant wail, rapidly crescendoing into a deafening roar that swallowed the quiet suburban street. 2 squad cars lurched onto the curb, their tires shrieking. I didn't wait for the officers to give instructions. My mind was a kaleidoscope of horrific possibilities, and they all centered on one man, Julian Vane. I had never trusted Julian. From the moment Cassandra brought him to our Thanksgiving table 5 years ago, I felt a visceral, deep-seated revulsion. He was new money, a sharp-featured, high-frequency trader who wore $5,000 suits like armor. He had this unsettling, predatory smirk, the kind of look a man gives a prize horse he's planning to run into the ground. He called me Artie despite my repeated corrections. He treated Eleanor like a senile maid, patting her on the shoulder with a condescending pity that made my teeth ache. Cassandra, my brilliant, fierce Cassandra, had changed since the wedding. She'd gone from a top-tier litigation attorney to a ghost, quiet, subdued, always checking her phone before she dared to laugh. I knew Julian was the architect of that change. I just didn't realize he was capable of demolition. "Clear the porch," a voice barked. It was Detective Silas Blackwood. I knew the name. He was a man with a reputation for being as hard as the pavement he walked on. He and his partner had their sidearms drawn, moving with practiced, lethal precision toward the front door. "This is the Greenwich Police. Open the door now." Blackwood's voice echoed off the neighboring houses. Silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing against your eardrums. "Breach it," Blackwood commanded. The heavy mahogany door, a piece I'd helped Cassandra pick out for its sturdiness, splintered under the weight of the officer's battering ram. The sound of the wood cracking was like a gunshot. I pushed past Garrett Vance, ignoring the officer's orders to stay back. I was a father, I was a husband. The rules of the world no longer applied to me. The moment I stepped into the foyer, the smell hit me. It wasn't just the smell of a home. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse. Metallic, coppery, and thick. The house was a ruin. A crystal chandelier had been clipped by something heavy, leaving glass shards scattered across the marble floor like frozen tears. A heavy velvet armchair had been overturned, and then my eyes traveled to the base of the grand staircase. "Oh God," I whispered. The scotch bottle fell from my hand, shattering on the marble, the smell of peat mixing with the copper. Eleanor, my Eleanor. She was lying at the bottom of the stairs, her body crumpled at an impossible, sickening angle. Her silver hair, usually serene in a perfect chignon, was fan-spread across the white tile, matted with a dark, spreading pool of crimson. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling she had helped decorate. "Evie!" I shrieked, my legs giving out. I collapsed onto the tile, my knees barking in pain, but I didn't feel it. I crawled toward her, my hands slipping in the wetness on the floor. "Eleanor, talk to me." "Speak to me, honey." "Don't touch her, sir." Blackwood was suddenly over me, his hand on my shoulder, pulling me back. "We need the paramedics." "Move." I was hysterical, a 71-year-old man reduced to a sobbing wreck. I looked at the blood on my hands, my wife's blood, and felt my sanity fraying at the edges. Who could have done this? Who could have laid a hand on the gentlest woman I had ever known? "Dad?" The voice came from the top of the stairs. It was thin, reedy, and vibrating with terror. I looked up. Cassandra was huddled on the second-floor landing, her silk robe torn at the shoulder, her face a grotesque mask of tears and smeared makeup. She was shaking so violently I thought she might fall over the railing herself. "Cassie?" I choked out. "Cassie, are you hurt?" She didn't answer me. Instead, her arm shot out, her finger trembling as she pointed to the shadows of the hallway behind her. "He did it," she wailed, a sound so raw it felt like a physical blow to my chest. "He pushed her, Dad. Julian pushed Mama. He tried to kill her." My head snapped toward the shadow she was pointing at, and there he was. Julian Vane stepped into the light of the hallway. He was still wearing his charcoal work suit, but the tie was gone. His white shirt was ripped at the collar, and his face, my breath hitched. 3 deep, angry red scratches ran from his left eye down to his jawline. Defensive wounds. Eleanor had fought him. My brave, beautiful wife had fought for her life against this monster. "Police! Hands in the air! Get on the ground now!" Blackwood roared, his weapon leveled at Julian's chest. Julian didn't move. He stood there like a statue, his eyes darting between me, the blood-soaked foyer, and Cassandra. He looked dazed, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. I didn't," he finally stammered, his voice sounding hollow, distant. "Arthur, you have to check the study. The safe." "Shut up," I screamed, the grief finally turning into a white-hot, cleansing rage. I tried to surge up the stairs, my hands clawing for his throat, but the officers tackled me, pinning my old bones to the cold marble. "You killed her, you worthless, social-climbing piece of filth. I'll see you dead for this." "Arthur, please," Julian yelled as Blackwood slammed him against the wall, the metallic clack of handcuffs echoing through the house. "It's not what it looks like. Look at her phone. Look at the accounts." "Get him out of here," Blackwood commanded. As they dragged Julian down the stairs, his boots scuffing the wood, he locked eyes with me one last time. There was no smirk now. There was only a terrifying, wide-eyed desperation. "The laptop, Arthur," he shrieked as they hauled him through the front door. "Check Cassandra's laptop." Then the door slammed, and he was gone. I was left in the ruin of my daughter's home, kneeling in my wife's blood, while paramedics swarmed Eleanor's body with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. Cassandra came down the stairs then, collapsing into my arms, her body a dead weight of grief. "He's been hurting me, Dad." She sobbed into my chest, her voice muffled by my suit jacket. "The miscarriage, he caused it. He hit me, and then Mom found out. She confronted him. She told him she was going to the police, and he snapped. He threw her down the stairs. I held her, my heart breaking for my daughter, for the life she had been living in secret. I felt a profound, burning shame. I had seen the fractures. I had seen the structural weaknesses in their marriage, and I had done nothing. I had let my wife walk into a den of lions to save our child, and it had cost her everything. But as I rocked my daughter back and forth, my gaze drifted to the floor, to the spot where Julian had been standing. Something caught the light near the base of the radiator, a small silver object. I didn't know it yet, but that tiny piece of metal was the first crack in the story my daughter was telling me, and by the time the truth was fully revealed, I would realize that the monster I had just sent to jail wasn't the only one in the room. The hospital waiting room was a sterile purgatory of humming fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial-grade disinfectant. It had been 7 hours since they wheeled Eleanor into emergency surgery. Every time the double doors swung open, my heart stalled, waiting for a doctor to deliver the sentence that would end my life. Severe cranial trauma, intracranial pressure, a medically induced coma. The words were a blur of technical jargon that failed to mask the simple, brutal truth. My wife was balanced on the edge of a razor. Cassandra was a broken shell in the chair beside me. She hadn't stopped trembling, her hands clutching a paper cup of lukewarm tea as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. I wrapped my arm around her, feeling the frantic rhythm of her breathing. "I failed her, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the vending machines. "I should have seen it coming. I should have protected her." "Don't you dare say that, Cassandra," I said, my own voice thick with a mixture of grief and simmering fury. "Julian did this. He's the monster, not you." She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a dark, haunted exhaustion. "You don't know the half of it. I was so ashamed. I didn't want to tell you and Mom because Julian always made it feel like it was my fault. Like I was the reason he was falling apart." "Falling apart?" I asked, my internal structural engineer's mind looking for the stress point. "Julian Vane? He acted like he owned the damn world." Cassandra let out a bitter, jagged sob. "It was a facade, Dad. All of it. The car, the watches, the investments. He's a sick man. He has a gambling addiction that has hollowed us out. He's gone through everything." The word hit me like a sledgehammer. Gambling. Suddenly, the new money arrogance made a different kind of sense. It wasn't the confidence of success. It was the desperate, frantic bluff of a man standing on a trapdoor. "How much, Cassie?" I asked. She looked away, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "He drained the joint accounts. All of it. The $100,000 you and Mom gave us for the house expansion? Gone. Lost on offshore high-stakes poker sites in less than 3 months. When Mom found out, when she confronted him in the study, he just lost his mind." I felt the blood drain from my face. That money was 40 years of Eleanor's careful budgeting and my long hours at the firm. It wasn't just cash. It was our sweat and our time. To think that Julian had flushed it away into the digital void made my stomach turn. "And the miscarriage?" I asked, dreading the answer. Cassandra's face crumpled. "There was no miscarriage, Dad," I lied. "I was so desperate to get Mom up here without Julian knowing the real reason. I was scared that if I told her the truth about the money, Julian would hurt me. I thought if she were here, he'd have to stay in line. But it just made him feel cornered." My skin crawled. I had sent Eleanor into a pressure cooker, thinking I was sending her to nurse a grieving daughter. My trust had been a fatal error. I had seen the hairline fractures in their marriage for years, but I'd ignored them because I didn't want to admit my daughter had made a mistake. I didn't want to admit I had failed to vet the foundation. "Mr. Sterling?" I looked up. Detective Silas Blackwood was standing at the entrance of the waiting room. He looked even more tired than he had at the house, his coat rumpled and his eyes sharp behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. He gestured for me to step into the hallway. I patted Cassandra's hand and stood up, my old joints protesting. Once we were out of earshot, Blackwood leaned against the beige wall, crossing his arms. "How is she?" he asked. "Stable. For now," I said. "What about him? Is he locked up?" "Julian Vane is in a holding cell at the precinct. He's been officially charged with attempted murder and domestic assault," Blackwood said, but his tone was neutral, devoid of the satisfaction I wanted to hear. "However, we've run into a bit of a snag in the narrative, Mr. Sterling." A cold prickle of unease traveled down my spine. "What kind of snag?" "My daughter saw him push her. She's the primary witness." Blackwood pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "I spent the last 2 hours interviewing your neighbor, Garrett Vance. The man who called 911. He's a retired Marine, Arthur. Very disciplined, very observant. He says he heard the argument through the open windows, just as he told you. But he's very specific about the voices. And he says he heard a man, presumably Julian, screaming, 'Cassandra, stop it, you're hurting her.' He also claims he heard Julian yelling for someone to give him the phone so he could call for help." I stared at Blackwood, a dry, bitter laugh escaping my throat. "Vance is an old man, Detective. The wind was blowing. There was chaos. He heard it backward. My daughter is a victim. She's been living in a house of horrors with a man who gambled away her life savings." Blackwood didn't blink. I'm aware of the financial situation. We've already started the forensic audit, but there's something else. We ran a background check on everyone in the house. Your son-in-law has a clean record. Not even a parking ticket, no history of violence, no complaints from previous partners. And? I snapped. Your daughter? Blackwood said, his voice dropping an octave. She has a sealed juvenile record, an aggravated assault charge when she was 16. She hospitalized a classmate over a perceived slight. It was expunged, but the details. They were violent, Arthur. I felt like I'd been kicked in the teeth. That was 20 years ago. She was a teenager. Kids get into fights. You're really standing here in a hospital trying to blame my daughter while my wife is in a coma? I'm not blaming anyone yet, Blackwood said calmly. I'm looking at the stress points. Julian Vane kept yelling about a laptop and a safe before we processed him. We're going to get warrants for both. He tipped his head and walked away, his footsteps echoing like a countdown. I stood there, paralyzed. I thought of the silver object I'd seen on the floor at the house. I had pocketed it in the chaos, barely thinking. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. It wasn't a piece of jewelry. It was a high-end, encrypted USB drive, the kind used by wealth managers for sensitive data. It was engraved with Julian's initials, JV. Dad, what did the detective want? Cassandra was standing in the doorway, her eyes darting between me and the hallway. She looked small, fragile, and utterly defenseless. But for the first time in my life, I found myself looking at her the way I looked at a building with a hidden structural flaw. I wondered what was behind the facade. Just some procedural questions, honey, I lied, slipping the USB drive back into my pocket. He said the investigation is moving forward. Good, she whispered, stepping closer and resting her head on my shoulder. I want him to rot. I want him to lose everything the way he tried to take everything from us. I held her, but the warmth was gone. I couldn't stop thinking about Julian's face as they dragged him away. He hadn't looked like a man who had just won. He had looked like a man who was watching the world collapse. I waited until Cassandra fell into a fitful sleep in the waiting room chair before I left the hospital. I told the nurse I was going home to get a change of clothes, but I didn't go back to the city. I drove straight back to the Greenwich estate. The yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the night breeze, a garish warning against the dark house. I used my spare key, the one Cassandra didn't know I had, and slipped inside. The house was silent, the air still heavy with that coppery metallic scent. I went straight to the study. It was a mess, books pulled from shelves, the heavy oak desk scarred by something sharp. I found the floor safe behind a fake panel in the wainscoting. Julian had mentioned a safe. I didn't have the combination, but I noticed something odd. There were scuff marks on the floor, fresh ones, as if the safe had been tampered with recently. Not by the police, these were messy, desperate marks. I sat at Julian's desk and pulled out his laptop, the one he'd begged me to check. It was password protected, but I've spent 40 years working with tech-savvy architects. I knew the common vulnerabilities. I tried Cassandra's birthday. Nothing. I tried their anniversary. Nothing. Then, I looked at the framed photo on the desk. It was Cassandra and Eleanor, taken 10 years ago. They looked so happy, so vibrant. On a hunch, I typed in my wife's maiden name. Access granted. My breath hitched. The desktop was cluttered, but one folder caught my eye. It was labeled Remedy. I opened it, and my world disintegrated for the second time that day. It wasn't Julian's gambling logs. It wasn't a record of his abuse. It was a series of bank transfers, hundreds of them, spanning the last 3 years. The money hadn't been lost to offshore poker sites. It had been systematically moved from the joint account into a private, numbered account in the Cayman Islands. And the IP address for every single one of those transfers didn't originate from Julian's office at the brokerage. They originated from right here, from this house, from this laptop. I sat in the dark, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, as a terrifying truth began to take shape. My daughter hadn't been the victim of a gambler. She was the architect of a fraud so massive it made my head spin. Suddenly, the floorboard creaked behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I could feel the cold draft from the open door and the presence of someone standing in the shadows. I didn't expect you to come back tonight, Dad. The voice wasn't reedy or trembling. It was cold. It was precise. It was a voice I didn't recognize. I slowly turned the chair around. Cassandra was standing in the doorway. She wasn't wearing her silk robe anymore. She was in a dark tracksuit, her hair pulled back tight. In her hand, she wasn't holding a cup of tea. She was holding a heavy, brass fire poker. You always did have a habit of looking too closely at the foundation, didn't you? She said, stepping into the room. But some things, Arthur, some things are better left buried. I sat frozen in Julian's leather office chair, the hum of the laptop fan sounding like a swarm of hornets in the suffocating silence of the study. I looked at Cassandra, my daughter, my flesh and blood, and for the first time in 35 years I didn't see my little girl. I saw a stranger standing in the doorway, her silhouette sharpened by the moonlight. The brass fire poker in her hand wasn't just a tool. In the dim light, it looked like a scepter of jagged, misplaced authority. "Put that down, Cassandra," I said, my voice cracking. I tried to summon the tone of the father who used to command her respect, the man who had taught her how to solve complex geometry at the kitchen table. "You're in shock. You don't know what you're doing." She took a step forward, the heavy brass head of the poker scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound was like a nail on a chalkboard, vibrating through my teeth. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Arthur. I'm protecting the foundation. Isn't that what you always told me? If the support beams are rotten, you cut them out before the whole structure collapses. Julian isn't the one who's rotten, is he?" I asked, gesturing weakly at the glowing screen. "The remedy folder, the offshore accounts, the $100,000 from our savings. It wasn't him, it was you." Cassandra's laugh was a sharp, brittle thing, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Julian? Julian couldn't find his own shadow without a spreadsheet. He was perfect, Dad. A high-flying, new money trader with a pedigree just shaky enough to be believable as a degenerate. I didn't even have to try that hard. I just let him be arrogant and let you be judgmental. You did half the work for me." My stomach turned. She had used my own prejudice against me like a weapon. I had spent 5 years looking at Julian through a lens of disdain, and she had played that bias like a virtuoso. I had been so busy watching the hairline fractures in Julian's character that I had missed the seismic shift in my own daughter's soul. "Why, Cassie?" I whispered. "We gave you everything. The best schools, the house, the legacy. Why would you steal from your own mother? Why would you hurt her?" Her eyes flared with a sudden localized heat. "Because everything was never enough, Arthur. You and Mom. You live in this quaint, old money bubble, where you clip coupons and drive the same car for a decade while sitting on millions. You called it frugality. I called it a cage. I wanted a life that matched the blueprints you were always drawing. I wanted power, not just a prestigious name." She moved closer, the poker held at her side, her knuckles white. "Mom found the laptop 3 days ago. She wasn't supposed to be here for recovery. She was here because Julian had started asking questions about the missing equity in the house. He thought he'd been hacked. Mom, being the perfect little detective she is, went digging while I was at the gym. She found the Cayman transfers. She found the dummy accounts." I felt a cold sweat break out across my brow. "And that's why you pushed her?" "I didn't push her," Cassandra snapped, her voice rising to a frantic pitch before she clamped it down. "I tried to explain. I told her it was for our future. I told her I was going to pay it back. But she started talking about accountability. She started talking about the police. She reached for the phone to call you, Arthur. She was going to destroy everything I'd built." "So you attacked her," I said, the horror of it finally settling into my bones. "I grabbed her arm," Cassandra whispered, her face twisting into a mask of frantic justification. She pulled away. "She tripped on that damn rug in the foyer. She went backward, Dad. She fell. It was an accident. But then Julian came running. He saw her on the floor, and he saw me holding her phone. He knew. I could see it in his eyes. He went for the kitchen, for the knife block. I had to defend myself. I had to make it look like he was the one who snapped. I thought of the scratches on Julian's face. They weren't defensive wounds from Eleanor. They were from Cassandra. She had clawed at him like a wild animal while he tried to get to the phone to save my wife. "You're sick, Cassandra," I said, pushing the chair back and standing up. My legs felt like they were made of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest movement. "You're going to call Detective Blackwood right now. You're going to tell him the truth." She smiled then, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "No, Dad. That's not how this structure works. You're going to help me. You're going to go back to that hospital, and you're going to tell everyone that Julian confessed to you in the foyer. You're going to say you saw him push her. If you don't," she gestured to the laptop, "I'll make sure the police find evidence that you were the one who helped me set up those accounts." "I've already planted the digital breadcrumbs, Arthur. Your IP address from the city apartment is all over the early transfers. You're 71. You won't survive a fraud investigation, let alone a prison sentence." I stared at her, my heart staggering. She had planned this. She had built a cage for me too. I looked at the brass poker, then at her eyes. She was waiting for me to crumble. She was waiting for the old man to give in to save his own skin. But she forgot one thing about structural engineers. We don't just build things, we know how to tear them down. You think you've covered every exit, don't you? I said, my voice regaining a measure of its old steel. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of the silver USB drive I'd found on the floor. Julian's drive. I didn't know what was on it yet, but the way Julian had shrieked about it as they dragged him away, it wasn't a plea. It was a warning. "What do you have in your pocket, Dad?" Cassandra's voice was low, dangerous. "Something Julian dropped," I said, pulling it out and holding it up in the moonlight. "Something you missed in your cleanup. He was a high-frequency trader, Cassie. He didn't just track his own money. He tracked every cent that moved through this house. If I had to guess, this drive contains the real logs. The ones you didn't have the password to delete." Her face went pale, the bravado flickering like a dying bulb. "Give that to me." "No," I said. "I'm going to walk out of this house. I'm going to go to the precinct, and I'm going to give this to Detective Blackwood. And if you try to stop me with that poker, you'll just be adding patricide to your list of failures." I started walking toward the door. Every fiber of my being expected the blow to land. I expected the cold brass to crush my skull, to end the story right there in the dark of the study. My back was a target, and my breath was a prayer. I reached the doorway. I felt her breath on the back of my neck. "You always were a stubborn old fool," she hissed. "But you won't get to the precinct, Arthur. You're an old man with a heart condition. The stress of tonight. People will understand when you don't make it through the drive." I didn't turn back. I walked through the foyer, past the dark stain on the marble, and out into the humid night air. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my car, but I forced myself to move. I got behind the wheel, the USB drive clutched in my palm like a talisman. I drove away from the estate, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I expected to see the headlights of her SUV cresting the hill at any moment. A dark shadow coming to finish the job. My chest felt tight, a genuine, crushing pressure that made it hard to swallow. Was it the heart condition she'd mocked, or just the weight of a father's shattered world? I was halfway to the Greenwich precinct when my phone buzzed in the center console. It was a restricted number. I swiped to answer, my voice a ragged whisper. "Hello? Mr. Sterling? This is the ICU at Greenwich Hospital." My heart stopped. "Is it my wife? Is she?" Mrs. Sterling regained consciousness for a brief moment, sir. She was agitated. She kept saying a name over and over. "Was it me?" I asked, a sliver of hope piercing the dark. "Did she ask for Arthur?" "No, sir," the nurse said, her voice sounding confused. "She kept saying Josephine. She said, the will. Tell Arthur about Josephine's will." And then she slipped back under. "The doctors are worried about a secondary hemorrhage. You need to get here immediately." Josephine's will. I hung up, my mind racing. Aunt Josephine, Eleanor's reclusive aunt who had died 20 years ago. She was a seamstress who lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Chicago. She hadn't left Eleanor anything but a porcelain music box and a collection of old thimbles, or so I thought. I looked at the silver USB drive in my hand. The pressure in my chest intensified. I wasn't just looking at a fraud anymore. I was looking at a secret Eleanor had kept from me for 2 decades, a secret that had clearly become a death warrant. I looked in the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights had just turned onto the highway behind me. They were high, bright, and gaining speed. I didn't know what was in Aunt Josephine's will, and I didn't know if Julian was a savior or a silent accomplice. But as the car behind me surged forward, I realized that the remedy Cassandra had planned wasn't just for her finances. It was for anyone who knew the truth. I didn't go to the precinct. I floored the accelerator, my vintage sedan groaning as I pushed it toward the hospital. If Eleanor was waking up, if she was trying to tell me the truth, I had to get there before the headlights in my mirror caught up. Because I knew, with the cold certainty of a man who understands structural failure, that if my wife died tonight, the truth would die with her and my daughter would be the one to bury us both. The headlights behind me were a pair of predatory eyes, unblinking and predatory. I pushed my vintage sedan harder than it had ever gone, the engine's rhythmic thrumming turning into a desperate, mechanical scream. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, the distance between my bumper and that black SUV seemed to shrink. Cassandra was driving like a woman possessed, weaving through the light late-night traffic with a terrifying, calculated aggression. She wasn't just following me. She was waiting for a stretch of road dark enough and empty enough to make her move. My chest felt as though a steel band was tightening around it. I reached into the glove compartment, fumbling for my nitroglycerin pills with one hand while keeping the other white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I popped a tablet under my tongue, the bitter taste a sharp reminder of my own mortality. I was 71 years old, being hunted by my own daughter through the winding back roads of Connecticut. The sheer absurdity of it should have been laughable, but the weight of the USB drive in my pocket, the weight of Julian's desperate, frantic warning, kept me grounded in the nightmare. As I neared the hospital, the traffic thickened. The high beams behind me flickered once, twice, and then the SUV veered off into a side street, disappearing from my sight. I didn't feel relief. I felt a cold, prickling dread. Cassandra wasn't giving up. She was repositioning. She knew exactly where I was going, and she knew the hospital was a public place where she could revert to her role as the grieving, traumatized daughter. I screeched into the emergency bay, abandoning the car at the curb. I stumbled into the lobby, my breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps. The automatic doors hissed shut behind me, a sound that felt like a momentary reprieve. I didn't wait for the elevator. I took the stairs to the ICU, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, every step an agonizing reminder of the structural failure occurring inside my own chest. When I reached Eleanor's floor, the silence was absolute, broken only by the muffled beeps of monitors and the soft scuff of a nurse's shoes. I moved toward Eleanor's room, my eyes searching the shadows. I expected Cassandra to jump out from behind a corner to finish the job she had started in the study, but the hallway was empty. I stepped into Eleanor's room. The air was cool, smelling faintly of lavender, a scent the nurses had added to help her transition. She looked so small amidst the forest of tubes and wires, her skin the color of parched parchment. I moved to her side, taking her hand. It was cold, so terribly cold. "Eleanor," I whispered, leaning in close. "Evie, I'm here. It's Arthur. Tell me about Josephine. Tell me what happened." Her eyelids fluttered, a minute movement that felt like a tectonic shift. Her lips moved, dry and cracked, making a faint clicking sound as she tried to form a word. I leaned in further, my ear almost touching her mouth. "Secret," she breathed. It was a ghost of a sound, a puff of air that carried the weight of 20 years. "The Chicago, safety deposit, the music box. Arthur, the key is in the music box." "What key, Eleanor? What's in Chicago?" "Josephine. She wasn't poor," Eleanor whispered, her voice gaining a momentary frantic clarity. "She left. 12 million. I hid it. I saw the look in Cassandra's eyes when she was a girl. That hunger. I knew. I tried to bury it, Arthur. I tried to keep the poison away from us." My mind reeled. $12 million. The seamstress aunt who lived in a rent-controlled apartment hadn't been a pauper. She had been a silent titan of old, hidden wealth. And Eleanor, my frugal coupon-clipping wife, had been sitting on a fortune for 2 decades. She had watched me fret over the firm's quarterly earnings, watched me worry about the cost of her own surgeries, all while holding the key to a life of unimaginable luxury. I felt a surge of confusion, of a betrayal so profound it threatened to drown my grief. "Why didn't you tell me, Eleanor? We were a team. We were a foundation." "I was protecting you," she gasped, her heart rate monitor beginning to spike. Beep, 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 beep. The vein blood. "It's tainted, Arthur. My father, his father, the gambling, the greed. I saw it in her. I saw Cassandra looking at the world like she wanted to eat it whole. I thought if there was no money, the hunger would die. But she found out. She found a letter from the Chicago bank. The monitor's alarm began to wail. A nurse burst into the room, followed quickly by a resident. "Sir, you need to step out. She's crashing." "Wait, Eleanor." I was pulled back by a pair of strong arms. "Eleanor, tell me where the key is." "The music box," she shrieked, her body arching off the bed in a final agonizing spasm. "Arthur, don't let her win." Then, the long, flat tone of the flatline filled the room. I was pushed out into the hallway, the doors swinging shut on the frantic efforts of the crash team. I stood there, paralyzed, the coppery taste of blood in my mouth from where I'd bitten my tongue. My wife was gone. The woman I had loved for nearly half a century was dead, and she had died holding a secret that had turned our daughter into a monster. "Dad?" I turned. Cassandra was standing 20 feet away at the end of the corridor. She was back in the silk robe she'd been wearing earlier, her face red and swollen from crying. She looked like the picture of a devastated child. Behind her, a group of hospital staff watched with sympathetic eyes. Is she gone?" Cassandra asked, her voice trembling with a perfect practiced pitch. I looked at her, and for a second, I saw the little girl who used to ask me to draw her castles made of clouds. Then, I looked at her hands. They were clenched at her sides, and I could see the tension in her forearms. She wasn't grieving. She was waiting to see if she was the sole heir. "She's gone, Cassandra," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. She let out a piercing shriek and collapsed to her knees, sobbing into her hands. People rushed to her, a nurse kneeling down to comfort her, but Cassandra's eyes, bright, cold, and calculating, met mine over the nurse's shoulder. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She thought she had won. She thought the secret had died with the flat line. I felt the USB drive in my pocket. I felt the weight of it, the cold metal pressing against my thigh. I didn't go to her. I didn't offer her comfort. I turned and walked toward the elevators, my gait stiff and heavy. I went to the hospital chapel, a small, quiet room filled with the scent of beeswax and old prayers. It was empty. I sat in the back pew, pulled out my tablet, and plugged in Julian's USB drive. I expected bank statements. I expected more of the remedy folder, but what appeared on the screen wasn't data, it was a video file. I clicked play. The image was grainy, taken from a hidden camera in the corner of Julian's study, the kind of security a man installs when he realizes he's living with a stranger. The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago. I saw Julian sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. Cassandra entered the frame. She looked different in the private shadows of their home, sharper, more predatory. "I know about the Chicago account, Julian," she said on the recording. Her voice was a low, melodic threat. "I know Mom has been hiding millions. And I know you've been helping her keep it from me." "I didn't know until yesterday, Cassie." Julian's voice was frantic. "And I'm not helping her hide it. She's terrified of you. She saw you forging Arthur's signature on those brokerage papers. She knows you're draining his retirement." "Arthur is old," Cassandra said dismissively. "He doesn't need that money. He's going to be dead in a few years anyway. But that 12 million, that's my birthright. And if you don't help me get the signature from the safety deposit box, I'll make sure the SEC gets an anonymous tip about your high-frequency trades." "You'll be in a federal pen before the weekend, Julian." "You're insane," Julian whispered. "You'd destroy your own father for a payout?" "I'd destroy anyone who stands in the way of the foundation," Cassandra replied. She stepped closer to him, her hand trailing along his jaw. "Now, give me the password to the secondary safe. Mom put the music box in there. I know she did." I paused the video. My hands were shaking so violently the tablet almost slid from my lap. She hadn't just stolen our savings. She had been systematically hollowing out my entire life, waiting for the moment to strike the killing blow. And Julian. Julian wasn't the gambler. He was the hostage. He hadn't been losing money. He had been trying to hide it from her, trying to keep the taint of the vein blood from consuming us all. I thought about the music box. It was currently sitting in a storage unit in the city, part of a collection of sentimental items. Cassandra had insisted we move out of our apartment months ago to make room for a renovation. I didn't know it yet. But the music box didn't just contain a key. It contained the final piece of evidence that would prove Cassandra hadn't just been a witness to her mother's death, she had been the director of the entire play. I left the chapel and headed back toward the ICU, but as I turned the corner, I saw Detective Blackwood. He was standing outside Eleanor's room, talking to a doctor. His face was grim. "Mr. Sterling," he said, seeing me. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Detective," I said, my voice steady. "My daughter. Where is she?" "She's being sedated in a private room," Blackwood said. "The shock was too much for her. But Arthur, there's something you need to see. We got the warrant for Julian's office. We found something in his desk. A life insurance policy on your wife. For $5 million. The sole beneficiary? Julian Vane." 1. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. 5 million. Another motive. Another layer of the facade. "He's the one, Arthur," Blackwood said, his hand on my shoulder. "The evidence is piling up. We found the scratches, the policy, the neighbor's testimony. It's an open and shut case." I looked at the detective, then at the tablet in my bag. I could have shown him the video right then. I could have ended it. But then I remembered Cassandra's face in the study. I remembered her threat to frame me for the fraud. If I gave the video to Blackwood now, she'd burn me down with her. She'd make sure I spent my last years in a cell while she used her victimhood to charm a jury. I needed the music box. I needed the final proof of her forgery. I needed to show the world that the hairline fracture wasn't in the son-in-law I hated, but in the daughter I had worshipped. "I need to go home, detective," I said, my voice a hollow echo. "I need to process this." "Of course," Blackwood said. "We'll be in touch." I walked out of the hospital, the night air hitting me like a physical blow. I knew what I had to do. I had to go to that storage unit. I had to find the music box before Cassandra's sedation wore off. Because I knew, with the cold, hard logic of an engineer, that if I didn't find that key tonight, the foundation of my life wouldn't just be broken, it would be erased. As I got into my car, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I saw you in the chapel, Artie. I didn't think you had it in you to go behind my back. Don't go to the storage unit. It's already been renovated." I looked up at the hospital windows. On the 3rd floor, in the shadow of a darkened room, I saw a figure standing by the glass. Even from the parking lot, I could see the faint blue glow of a cell phone. The game hadn't ended with Eleanor's death. It had just entered the final, most violent phase. The drive to the storage facility in Long Island City felt like a descent into a deeper circle of hell. The industrial skeletons of the city loomed over the expressway, their rusted iron beams mirroring the decay of my own life. My hands were frozen on the wheel, the digital warning from my daughter vibrating in my mind like a rhythmic toothache. "Don't go to the storage unit. It's already been renovated." I knew exactly what that meant in Cassandra's lexicon. Renovated meant destroyed. It meant sterilized. It meant the structural evidence of the past had been knocked down to make room for her new, polished narrative. Safekeep Storage was a gargantuan, windowless monolith made of corrugated steel and fluorescent hum. I arrived at 2 a.m., the cold air of the waterfront biting through my thin suit jacket. I checked the rearview mirror one last time, no headlights. She wasn't following me now. She didn't need to. She was already inside my head, playing on the senile old man persona she had so carefully constructed for the doctors. I swiped my access card at the gate. The green light blinked, and the gate groaned open like a heavy, tired sigh. I made my way to Unit 402. My breath hitched as I turned the corner of the narrow, echoing hallway. The heavy rolling door was slightly ajar. I didn't call for help. I didn't reach for my phone. I simply pushed the door upward. The screech of metal on metal was deafening in the hollow corridor. The unit was a disaster. Plastic crates had been upended, their contents, our lives, our decades of shared history scattered across the concrete floor. Eleanor's vintage dresses had been shredded, their lace collars torn like delicate wings. My old drafting sets, the precision tools I'd used to design some of Manhattan's sturdiest foundations, had been snapped in half. But it was the center of the room that stopped my heart, the porcelain music box. It was a delicate, hand-painted piece Eleanor had cherished since Aunt Josephine's funeral. It was lying in the middle of the floor, shattered into 100 white and blue shards. The tiny gold-plated ballerina that used to twirl to the tune of Claire de Lune was bent at the waist, her porcelain arms reaching out for a partner that was no longer there. I fell to my knees, the cold concrete biting into my joints. I began to sift through the wreckage, my fingers trembling. She'd found it. Cassandra had gotten here first. She had smashed the box to find the key Eleanor had mentioned in her final gasping breath. "Looking for this, Artie?" I spun around. Cassandra was standing in the doorway, leaning against the metal frame. She looked remarkably composed for someone who had just lost her mother and spent the night being sedated. She was wearing a trench coat, her eyes sharp and predatory in the flickering light of the hallway's motion sensor bulbs. Between her thumb and forefinger, she held a small, antique skeleton key. "Mom was so predictable," Cassandra said, her voice dripping with a casual, terrifying disdain. She thought she was being clever, hiding the key to $12 million in a piece of kit she knew I hated. She always underestimated my willingness to break things she loved. "She was your mother, Cassandra," I whispered, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "She died tonight. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "It means I'm finally free of her judgment," Cassandra snapped, her voice losing its cool edge for a fleeting second. "It means the taint she was so obsessed with, the vein blood, is finally going to be put to good use." She called it a curse. I call it a competitive advantage. She stepped into the unit, her boots crunching on the shards of the music box. "Now, give me the USB drive." I saw you in the chapel. I know you watched the video. You have 10 seconds to hand it over before I call the facility's security and tell them my confused, grieving father has had a psychotic break and is destroying my property. I looked at her, the architect of this ruin. I thought of Eleanor's face, of the years she'd spent hiding this fortune, not out of greed, but out of a desperate, primal fear of what this money would do to our child. She had seen the hairline fracture in Cassandra's character long before I did. She had tried to shore up the foundation with frugality and silence, but the rot had already set in. "You won't get the drive, Cassandra," I said, standing up. I felt a strange, cold calm wash over me. The structural engineer was back. I was no longer a father. I was a man looking at a building that needed to be condemned for the safety of the public, and you won't get the Chicago account. She laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "I have the key, Arthur. I have the power of attorney paperwork you signed 6 months ago when you thought you were simplifying your estate. I have everything." "You have a key to a safety deposit box," I said, stepping toward her. "But you don't have the location. Aunt Josephine didn't use a major bank. She used a private trust company in the North Loop that requires a biometric secondary verification, a verification that was tied to Eleanor's signature, and mine." Cassandra's eyes narrowed. The smirk wavered. "You're lying. I helped Josephine set it up, Cassandra." Eleanor kept the secret from me, but she didn't realize I was the one who recommended the firm to Josephine 20 years ago. "The key in your hand is useless without me, and I'm not signing a damn thing." She lunged at me then, her hand outstretched to grab my throat, but I shoved her back with a strength I didn't know I still possessed. She stumbled against a stack of crates, her face contorting with a sudden, ugly rage. "You're going to die in a cell, Arthur," she shrieked. "I'll tell Blackwood about the offshore accounts. I'll tell him you were the one who pushed Julian to gamble. I'll bury you." "I'm already buried, Cassie," I said, walking past her into the hallway. "I buried my wife tonight. There's nothing left for you to take." I walked away, her screams of fury echoing down the metal corridor like the sounds of a building finally, irrevocably collapsing. I didn't look back. I got into my car and drove. I didn't go to the precinct. I didn't go back to the hospital. I went to the one place where I knew I could find the truth without the filter of Cassandra's lies. The Greenwich County Jail was a grim, gray fortress. It took 3 phone calls and a substantial contribution to a legal defense fund to get an emergency meeting with Julian Vane. When they brought him into the glass-walled visitor's room, I almost didn't recognize him. Julian was stripped of his armor, no suit, no watch, no smirk. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look sallow and diminished. The scratches on his face were scabbing over, dark reminders of the night his life ended. He sat down, his hands trembling as he picked up the receiver. "Arthur," he whispered. Is Eleanor?" "She's gone, Julian," I said. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracking through the stubble on his cheek. "I'm so sorry. I tried to catch her. I swear to God, I tried to catch her before she hit the steps. But Cassandra, she's so fast. She's like a different person when she's angry." "I know," I said. "I saw the video, Julian. I saw her threatening you. I saw what she was doing with the accounts." Julian looked up, a spark of hope flickering in his hollow eyes. "You have the drive? You saw it? Arthur, you have to take it to the police. You have to tell them." "I can't," I said. "Not yet. She's framed me, Julian. She's tied my IP address to the fraud. If I go to Blackwood now, she'll make sure we both rot while she walks away with $12 million of Eleanor's family money." Julian let out a dry, rattling laugh. $12 million? Is that what she thinks is in there? I paused, the receiver cold against my ear. "That's what Eleanor said." "Aunt Josephine's estate." Julian leaned closer to the glass, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Arthur, listen to me. I'm a high-frequency trader. I track digital footprints for a living. I didn't just find the remedy folder. I found the origin of Josephine's money." "What are you talking about?" "Josephine didn't make that money in Chicago," Julian said. "She was a front. She was a straw man for a series of shell companies based in Panama. That $12 million, it wasn't an inheritance, it was a payout. A payout for a project you worked on 30 years ago. The Kensington Heights collapse, remember? My blood didn't just turn to slush this time. It froze solid. The Kensington Heights project, it was the only black mark on my career. A luxury residential tower in Midtown that had suffered a catastrophic structural failure during construction. 3 workers had died. I had been the lead engineer, but the investigation had cleared me. blaming the concrete supplier instead. The investigation was rigged, Arthur, Julian whispered, his eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. The concrete company didn't fail. The blueprints were altered after you signed off on them to save $30 million in structural costs. And the person who authorized the changes, the person who took the kickback and funneled it through Josephine's will to Eleanor. It wasn't Julian Vane. It was a man named Harrison Sterling, your brother. My mind fractured. My brother, Harrison, he had been the developer on that project. He had died in a car accident 2 years after the collapse. I had always thought he was a victim of the same bad luck that had haunted my career. Eleanor knew, Julian continued. She found the ledger in Harrison's safe after he died. She didn't hide the money because she was afraid of Cassandra's taint. She hid it because it was blood money, Arthur. It was the price of 3 lives. And she knew that if the truth came out, your reputation, your foundation, your entire life would be demolished. I sat in the silence of the jail visiting room, the hum of the air conditioner sounding like the roar of a falling building. My wife hadn't been protecting Cassandra from a curse. She had been protecting me from my own brother's crimes. And now, Cassandra had the key. She didn't just have the money. She had the ledger that would prove her own father was either a co-conspirator or a catastrophic failure. She's going to use it, isn't she? I asked. She doesn't care about your reputation, Arthur, Julian said. She'll burn you to the ground to get that $12 million. She'll tell the world you were the one who cut the corners at Kensington Heights. She'll make you the villain of the story to make herself the victimized heir. What happened next changed everything. The door to the visiting room swung open. Detective Silas Blackwood stepped inside, his face like flint. He wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking at me. Mr. Sterling, Blackwood said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. We just finished a forensic sweep of your daughter's estate. We found something in the basement, something you didn't mention. What? I asked, my heart hammering. A second set of blueprints for Kensington Heights, Blackwood said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt, along with a signed confession from your wife, Eleanor, dated 3 days ago. She didn't fall, Arthur. She didn't trip. According to her statement, she was trying to protect the evidence of your crimes from Julian, and you killed her to keep her quiet. I looked at the handcuffs, then at the glass where Julian was staring at me in horror. The trap hadn't been set tonight. It had been built decades ago, brick by brick, by the people I trusted most. Cassandra hadn't just pushed Eleanor. She had rewritten the very blueprints of our lives. I didn't do it, I whispered, but as the steel ratcheted shut around my wrists, I realized that in a world of structural failure, the only thing that matters isn't the truth, it's who's left standing when the dust clears. The cold bite of the steel handcuffs was a finality I hadn't expected. As Detective Blackwood led me through the fluorescent-lit corridors of the precinct, the sound of my own footsteps echoed like the ticking of a clock counting down to 0. I was a man who had built monuments to human ambition, structures meant to last centuries, yet I was being dismantled in a matter of hours by a daughter I had raised to be the cornerstone of my life. I was placed in an interrogation room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. A single metal table sat bolted to the floor, flanked by 2 chairs that looked like they had been designed to discourage anyone from getting comfortable. Blackwood sat across from me, tossing a thick manila folder onto the table with a heavy thud. You've lived a long life, Arthur, Blackwood said, his voice a low, rhythmic grate. A prestigious life. People in this city look at the Sterling name and see excellence. But under that polished exterior, there's a lot of rot, isn't there? You're making a mistake, detective, I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the tremors racking my chest. The blueprints, the confession. My daughter planted them. She killed my wife. She pushed her to protect the secret of that money. Blackwood leaned forward, the light reflecting off his glasses so I couldn't see his eyes. We found the confession in your wife's personal stationery box, Arthur. It was written in her hand, with her fountain pen. It detailed how you've been living a lie for 30 years, how you let those men die at Kensington Heights to protect your brother's bottom line. She wrote that you were becoming paranoid, that you were threatening Julian, and that she feared for her life. He slid a photograph across the table. It was a close-up of the letter. The handwriting was a perfect match for Eleanor's elegant, looped script, but as an engineer, I was trained to look for the minute details, the weight of the ink, the pressure of the pen. I didn't tell him what I saw. I didn't tell him that Eleanor always crossed her T's with a slight upward stroke when she was agitated, a detail missing from this cold, methodical forgery. If I told him now, he'd dismiss it as the rambling of a guilty man. I needed to be smarter. I needed to build a case the way I built a skyscraper, one floor at a time. Why would Julian have a $5 million policy on her then? I asked. Because he knew you were coming for her, Blackwood countered. He was trying to create a safety net for her if she finally worked up the courage to leave you. He wasn't the monster, Arthur. He was the protector. That's what Cassandra says, and that's what the evidence supports. I sat in that cell for 48 hours, 2 days of gray walls and the distant, hollow clang of cell doors. I watched the news on a small, flickering monitor in the common area. Cassandra was everywhere. She was the grieving heiress, standing on the steps of the Sterling Vane estate in a black veil, announcing a foundation in her mother's name to support victims of domestic volatility. She looked radiant in her sorrow, a masterclass in public manipulation. She was already liquidating the Chicago assets, moving the blood money into her own accounts while I sat in a jumpsuit, branded a murderer and a fraud. I hit rock bottom on the second night. The realization that I might die in this place, my legacy erased and my wife's memory desecrated by our own child, almost broke me. I thought of the Kensington Heights collapse, the guilt I'd carried for decades, believing I had simply been negligent. To know that my own brother had sold my soul for 30 pieces of silver, and that Eleanor had spent her life carrying that burden for me, it was a weight no foundation could bear. But then, I remembered the porcelain shards. When I was at the storage unit, before Cassandra arrived, I had pocketed a tiny fragment of the music box, the base of the ballerina's stand. It was a small white porcelain disc, no bigger than a quarter. In the chaos of my arrest, the police hadn't found it. It was tucked into the hidden watch pocket of my trousers. I pulled it out in the dim light of my cell. On the underside of the porcelain, there was a faint, blue stamp. It wasn't a manufacturer's mark. It was a series of numbers and letters, handwritten in indelible ink, NLT192B6. My breath hitched. Eleanor wasn't just a woman of secrets. She was a woman of ciphers. She knew that if Cassandra ever found the music box, she'd destroy it. So she hadn't hidden the key inside the box. She had hidden the location of the real key on the box itself. NLT, North Loop Trust, 192B6. A locker or a box number. The key Cassandra had taken from the wreckage, the antique skeleton key, was a decoy, a stress point designed to fail, drawing the predator away from the actual structure. Eleanor had led Cassandra on a wild goose chase to Chicago, knowing that without the biometric signature and the correct box number, my daughter would be stuck in a bureaucratic nightmare while I had the chance to fix the foundation. I didn't have much time. Cassandra would figure out the key was a dud within days. I needed an ally, and there was only one person in this entire mess who was just as motivated to see Cassandra fall as I was. The next morning, I requested a meeting with my lawyer. Not the high-priced corporate shark Cassandra had suggested, but a man I'd known for 30 years, Elias Thorne. Elias was a bulldog of a defense attorney, a man who didn't care about prestige, only about the cracks in the prosecution's case. "Arthur, you're in a bad way," Elias said as he sat across from me in the visitor's room. "The confession is damning. The blueprints are genuine. Blackwood is looking for a conviction that makes his career." "I know," I said, leaning in close to the glass. "But the confession is a forgery, Elias. And the fingerprints on those blueprints? They won't be mine. They'll be my brother's, frozen in the oil of the paper for 30 years. But there's something else. I need you to get a message to Julian Vane." Elias raised an eyebrow. "The man you've spent 5 years trying to ruin? He's the only one who can help me now," I said. "He knows how the digital money moves. I need him to track the Cayman transfers again. I need him to find the handshake the moment Cassandra's laptop connected to my city IP address. There will be a lag, Elias. A millisecond of latency that proves the connection was routed through a VPN from the Greenwich house. And what do I tell him in exchange? Tell him I know about the $5 million policy," I whispered, "and tell him I know he didn't take it out for Eleanor. He took it out for himself. He knew Cassandra was going to kill him next, and he wanted to make sure that if he died, the investigation would be so massive she couldn't hide in the shadows." Julian Vane hadn't been a gambler or a hostage. He had been a man playing a game of high-stakes survival against a psychopath. Elias left, and for the first time in days, I felt the structural integrity of my resolve return. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was planning a controlled demolition. 2 days later, the reversal began. Detective Blackwood burst into my cell, his face no longer flinty, but flushed with a simmering, confused anger. "Sterling, stand up." Your lawyer just filed a motion that's turning the DA's office upside down. What motion? I asked, though I already knew. The fingerprints. Blackwood spat. We ran a deep scan on the blueprints we found in the basement. You were right. They aren't yours. They belong to Harrison Sterling. And the confession letter? We ran a chemical analysis on the ink. It's a vintage blend, consistent with your wife's pens, but the pressure points on the paper, they were mechanical. Someone used a CNC plotter to mimic her handwriting. I let out a breath I'd been holding for a lifetime. Cassandra had been too perfect. She had used a machine to ensure the handwriting was identical, but a machine doesn't have the soul of a human hand. It doesn't have the hairline fractures that make a signature real. But that doesn't clear you of the murder, Arthur, Blackwood said, gripping the bars of the cell. Your daughter just gave us a new piece of evidence, a recording from the night of the fall. She says she hidden recorded the argument between you and Eleanor in the foyer. My heart stalled. A recording? Yeah, Blackwood said, pulling out a digital recorder. Listen. He pressed play. A voice filled the small cell, my voice, or a terrifyingly close approximation of it. You're going to give me that key, Eleanor. I don't care if I have to throw you down those stairs myself. You won't keep Harrison's money from me. Then, the sound of a struggle, a scream, and the sickening heavy thud of a body hitting marble. I stared at the recorder, the blood draining from my face. It was perfect. The tone, the cadence, the words. It was a digital ghost, a deep fake so convincing it made my own skin crawl. I never said that, I whispered. I wasn't even in the house when she fell. The timestamp says otherwise, Blackwood said, his eyes narrowing. And the GPS on your car shows you were parked in the driveway 10 minutes before the 911 call. I looked at Blackwood, and then I realized the true scope of Cassandra's genius. She hadn't just framed me. She had used my own car, my own voice, and my own history to build a prison I couldn't escape. I didn't know it yet, but the reversal I thought I was orchestrating was just another floor in her skyscraper. But as Blackwood turned to leave, my phone, which had been returned to my lawyer, buzzed on the table in the evidence bag. Elias had left it there by mistake, or perhaps by design. A text appeared on the lock screen. It was from Julian's legal team. Arthur, the handshake isn't just a VPN. Check the metadata of the audio recording. She didn't use a CNC plotter for just the letter. She used the same AI to build the voice. But AI has a signature, a digital echo that only appears when the file is played at a specific frequency. I looked at Blackwood's back as he walked away. He had the recording. He had the proof. But he didn't have the frequency. Detective, I called out. He stopped, turning slowly. What now, Sterling? The recording, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Ask your tech team to play it at 144 hertz and tell them to look for the ghost in the machine. I didn't know if Julian was right. I didn't know if the foundation would hold. But as Blackwood frowned and walked back toward the tech lab, I knew that the real war hadn't even begun, because what happened next wasn't just a revelation. It was a betrayal that would change the very definition of family. It took 6 hours for the tech lab to confirm what Julian's message had hinted at. 6 hours of sitting in that gray room, listening to the muffled sounds of a precinct that wanted to believe I was a killer. When the door finally opened, it wasn't the rough shove of a guard. It was Detective Blackwood, and he looked like he'd just seen a ghost. He didn't say a word at first. He just sat down, pulled out a tablet, and played the audio file again. But this time, it was different. At 144 hertz, the deep, resonant tones of my voice began to fray at the edges. Beneath the sound of the struggle, there was a rhythmic, digital pulse, a microscopic hiss that matched the cooling fan of a high-end processor. But the real kill shot wasn't the hiss. It was the background noise. We isolated the ambient sound, Blackwood said, his voice flat. When your voice is shouting, there's a bird chirping in the background, a specific call, the northern cardinal. Problem is, Arthur, that cardinal only sings like that in the early morning. Your car's GPS put you at the house at 4:15 p.m. The audio was stitched together from a recording made at dawn. The structural integrity of the prosecution's case didn't just crack, it vanished. By 9 p.m., a judge had signed my release on a signature bond. I was a free man, but I was a man without a home, a wife, or a daughter. Don't leave the state, Sterling, Blackwood warned as he handed me my personal effects. Cassandra is still the one pointing the finger, and until we prove she's the one who made that file, you're still a person of interest. I'm not going anywhere, Detective. I said, gripping the small porcelain disc from the music box in my pocket. I'm just going to finish what Eleanor started. I didn't go back to the estate. I didn't go to my apartment. I took a midnight flight to Chicago. I had 48 hours before Cassandra realized her digital ghost had been exorcised. I needed to reach the North Loop Trust before she figured out that the antique key was a distraction. Chicago was a city of wind and iron, a place that felt more honest than the manicured lawns of Greenwich. I stood before the North Loop Trust building a windowless, granite fortress that looked like it could withstand a nuclear strike. This wasn't a bank. It was a vault for the secrets of the ultra-wealthy, the kind of place where privacy was the only currency that mattered. I walked into the lobby, the air smelling of ozone and expensive filtration. I presented the porcelain disc and my ID to a man behind a desk of solid obsidian. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer condolences. He simply led me down 3 levels of security, through 2 biometric checkpoints, and into a room lined with stainless steel lockers. Locker 192B6, I said. The clerk stepped back. This locker requires a dual signature biometric. One has been pre-authorized by the late Mrs. Sterling. The second must be provided by the primary trustee. I placed my hand on the glass scanner. For a heartbeat, the machine hummed, searching the database for the unique ridges of my skin, the blueprint of my identity. Access granted. The locker clicked open with a sound like a heavy deadbolt. Inside, there were no gold bars. There were no stacks of cash. There was only a single, weathered leather ledger and a small, digital recording device, the old-fashioned kind, the one Cassandra's AI couldn't touch. I opened the ledger first. My brother Harrison's handwriting filled the pages. It was a meticulous record of the Kensington Heights kickbacks. Every dollar, every altered blueprint, every bribe paid to the city inspectors. It was a map of a massacre. And there, tucked into the back cover, was a letter from Eleanor. Arthur, the letter began, her elegant script, a knife to my heart. If you are reading this, the hunger has finally won. I spent 20 years trying to starve the greed out of our daughter. I thought if I kept the money a secret, she would grow up to be like you, a builder, a man of integrity. I was wrong. The vein blood is a slow-acting poison, and it has finally reached her heart. This money is tainted. It's the price of 3 lives. I couldn't spend it, but I couldn't destroy it. I kept it as a cage for the truth. I felt a tear hit the paper, blurring the ink. Eleanor hadn't just been protecting me. She had been waiting for the moment Cassandra proved herself unworthy. The $12 million wasn't an inheritance, it was a trap. I knew you'd find it eventually, Dad. You always were the best at reading the fine print. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. The click of her heels on the steel floor was as familiar to me as my own pulse. Cassandra was standing in the doorway of the vault, her silhouette framed by the harsh security lights. She wasn't wearing the black veil anymore. She was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, her eyes glittering with a cold, triumphant light. "How did you get in here, Cassandra?" I asked, closing the ledger. "I'm your daughter, Arthur. I have a temporary court order granting me access to all familial trusts during the investigation. The clerk couldn't stop me, and honestly, I should thank you. You did the legwork. You found the ghost locker for me." She stepped into the small room, her hand outstretched. "Give me the ledger, Dad, and the recorder. We can end this right now. I'll have my lawyers drop the domestic volatility claims. You can go back to your quiet life, and I'll take this blood money and turn it into something useful." "Useful?" I asked, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. "Like a Nongar remedy folder? Like framing an innocent man for your own mother's death?" "Julian wasn't innocent. He was a parasite," Cassandra shrieked, her mask finally slipping. "He was going to tell you everything. He was going to take my future away because he felt guilty. Guilt is for people who can't afford the consequences, Arthur. I've moved the 12 million. It's already in transit to a series of crypto accounts. All I need is the ledger to ensure the paper trail to Kensington Heights is burned." "You already moved the money?" I asked, my heart hammering. "Digital signatures are so much faster than biometric ones if you know where the back doors are." She smirked. "While you were flying to Chicago, I was busy at the Greenwich house. I didn't need the key, Dad. I just needed to be the sole survivor in the eyes of the bank's AI. They don't check for cardinal chirps in a transfer request." She reached for the ledger, but I pulled it back. "What you don't know, Cassandra," I said, my voice gaining a terrifying hollow weight, "is that Eleanor didn't just leave a record of the past. She left a record of the present." I picked up the small recording device from the locker. I pressed play. A voice filled the vault. It wasn't my deepfake voice. It was Cassandra's. I pushed her. Julian. I pushed her because she wouldn't stop talking about restitution. She was going to give the $12 million to the families of the Kensington victims. She was going to ruin me. So I shoved her, and I'd do it again to anyone who stands in my way. The recording wasn't from a hidden camera. It was from Eleanor's phone, the one Cassandra thought she'd wiped. Eleanor had started a recording the moment the argument began, and she had set it to auto-upload to the North Loop Trust's secure server. The color drained from Cassandra's face. The predator was gone, replaced by a cornered, panicked animal. That idiot too. That's not real. It's a fake. You made that. No, Cassie, I said, stepping toward her. This is the real foundation, the one you couldn't knock down with a plotter or a VPN. Detective Blackwood is listening to this right now. I called him the moment I entered the vault. The line has been open the whole time. From the hallway, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed. A dozen tactical officers swarmed the vault, their weapons drawn. Detective Blackwood was at the front, his face a mask of cold, professional disgust. Cassandra Vane Sterling, Blackwood said, you are under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Sterling and the attempted framing of Arthur Sterling. Put your hands behind your head. As the officers moved in, Cassandra didn't fight. She didn't scream. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. You think you won? She hissed as they ratcheted the cuffs shut. You think you're the hero? You're the one who built the towers that fell, Arthur. You're the one who lived on blood money for 30 years. You're just as rotten as I am. Maybe, I said, watching them lead her away. But I'm the one who's going to spend the rest of my life making sure those families finally get what they're owed. The structure is falling, Cassandra, and I'm going to be the one who clears the rubble. I stood alone in the vault, the ledger of my family's sins clutched in my hand. I had lost my wife. I had lost my daughter. I had lost my name. But as I looked at the recording device, the tiny, simple machine that had saved me, I realized that the most important part of any building isn't the steel or the granite. It's the truth that sits beneath it. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't in the vault. It was waiting for me back in Greenwich, in the safe I thought was empty. Because as I walked out of the North Loop Trust, my phone buzzed with one final message from Julian Vane. Arthur, the $12 million wasn't just in Panama. Check the insurance policy again, the one for $5 million. Julian wasn't the beneficiary. The secondary beneficiary was a name you haven't heard in 30 years. A name that changes everything. I stared at the screen, my breath catching. The name wasn't Julian. It wasn't Cassandra. It was Kensington Heights Survivor Fund. Eleanor hadn't just been hiding the money. She had been building a weapon of mass restitution. And the final person I needed to face wasn't my daughter. It was the man who had helped Eleanor set the whole thing up from the beginning. The man I had just left in a jail cell. The flight back to New York was the longest of my life. I sat in the cramped seat of the red eye, the leather ledger of my brother's crimes heavy against my lap. Outside the window, the clouds were a bruised purple, illuminated by the distant, flickering lights of cities I had helped build. I looked at my hands, the hands of a man who had spent 71 years believing in the permanence of steel and the purity of mathematics. I had lived a life of rigid angles and unwavering lines, only to find that the entire structure was built on a swamp of blood and silence. When I landed, Detective Blackwood was waiting at the gate. He didn't have handcuffs this time. He had a cup of coffee and a look of profound, weary respect. We didn't speak as we walked through the terminal. The morning news was already flashing on the overhead monitors. Socialite Cassandra Vane Sterling arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud and murder plot. Her face, captured in a grainy cell phone video as she was led out of the vault in Chicago, looked like a gargoyle's twisted, snarling, and utterly devoid of the grace she had traded for a lie. "We have Julian," Blackwood said as we reached his cruiser. "The DA dropped the charges an hour ago. The digital evidence you provided from the vault, combined with the recording your wife left behind. It's over, Arthur. Your daughter isn't getting out. Not for 20 years, maybe never." "I need to see him," I said. "I need to see Julian." We drove to the Greenwich precinct. The morning sun was beginning to burn through the Atlantic fog, casting long, sharp shadows over the suburban estates. The world looked beautiful, but I knew better now. I knew the hairline fractures that lived behind every polished facade. Julian was sitting on a bench outside the station, squinting at the sun. He was wearing a borrowed sweatshirt and jeans, looking less like a high-frequency trader and more like a man who had just survived a shipwreck. When he saw me, he stood up slowly, The scratches on his face were now dark scabs. The permanent map of the night, the foundation collapsed. I walked up to him, the old money pride that had defined my life for decades finally crumbling into the pavement. I didn't see a parasite. I didn't see a new money hustler. I saw a man who had carried my wife's burden when I was too blind to notice it. "I'm sorry, Julian," I said. The words felt like they were being pulled from my lungs. I was a fool. I judged the architecture without ever looking at the soul of the building. Julian looked at me for a long time. There was no smirk. There was no smugness. There was only a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. "You were doing what you were trained to do, Arthur. You were looking for the flaws you expected to see. Cassandra knew that. She relied on it. She knew you'd never look at her if you were too busy looking at me." "The insurance policy," I said, my voice shaking. "The Kensington Heights Survivor Fund. You helped her set that up, didn't you? You and Eleanor." Julian nodded, leaning back against the brick wall of the station. "Eleanor came to me 2 years ago. She found out I was tracking the remedy folder. She thought I was the one stealing. At first, when we realized it was Cassandra, Eleanor didn't want to go to the police. She was a mother, Arthur. She thought she could starve the greed out of her daughter, but she knew that if she failed, there had to be a safety net. Not for her, and not for you, but for the people Harrison killed 30 years ago." He took a shaky breath. "She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would make sure the $5 million went to the fund. I took out the policy in my name to keep Cassandra from seeing it on the estate's tax returns. I was the secondary beneficiary because we knew Cassandra would try to kill me if she ever found out. The fund was the only way to ensure the blood money actually paid the debt." I looked at the ledger in my hand. "It's all here. Every bribe, every cut corner. My brother, he was a murderer. Thanks. And your wife was a saint," Julian whispered. "She loved you enough to keep your name clean, Arthur. She knew that if the Kensington truth came out while you were still building, your career would be over. She protected your foundation for 30 years, even while it was rotting her from the inside." I felt a sob break through my chest, a raw, ugly sound that I didn't bother to hide. I had spent 45 years with a woman I thought I knew perfectly, only to realize I hadn't understood the half of her strength. She had lived in the shadows of my brother's crimes, clipping coupons and living a quiet life of frugality, not out of habit, but as a silent daily act of penance. "What now?" I asked. "Now we finish it," Julian said. "The next 3 months were a blur of legal proceedings and structural demolition. I didn't fight for the $12 million. I didn't fight for the estate in Greenwich or the apartment in the city. I sat with Julian and Elias Thorne and systematically liquidated every asset tied to the Sterling name. The $12 million from Aunt Josephine's secret account didn't go to my retirement. It went to the descendants of the 3 men who had died in the Kensington Heights collapse. I met them, the sons and daughters who had grown up without fathers because my brother wanted to save $30 million. I sat in their modest living rooms, and I handed them the ledger. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I just gave them the truth. Cassandra's trial was short and brutal. The evidence was too absolute: the audio recording from Eleanor's phone, the digital footprints of the AI voice synthesis, the physical evidence of the shove. She sat in the courtroom with that same cold, defiant stare, refusing to look at me. When the judge read the sentence, 25 years to life, she didn't flinch. She just turned to her lawyer and asked about the status of her remaining offshore accounts. She was a vain to the very end. The taint Eleanor had feared wasn't a curse of blood. It was a curse of choice. Cassandra had chosen the gold over the soul, and now she had all the gold she could ever want, locked away in a cell where it couldn't buy her a single minute of freedom. I moved out of the city. I bought a small, one-story cottage on the coast of Maine, far away from the skyscrapers and the marble foyers. It's a simple structure, wood and stone, built on a foundation of solid granite. There are no stairs. Julian comes to visit once a month. He's started his own firm now, one focused on ethical investment and forensic auditing. He doesn't wear $5,000 suits anymore. He wears a look of peace that I never thought I'd see on his face. We sit on the porch and watch the tide come in, 2 men who lost everything and found something far more durable in the rubble. I spend my days in the garden, planting peonies for Eleanor. My hands still have the tremor, the one that started the night I saw her on the floor. I used to hate it. I thought it was a sign of structural failure. Now, I see it as a reminder. It's the vibration of a building that has been tested by the storm and is still standing. Last week, I received a letter from the prison. It was from Cassandra. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I know what's inside: more blame, More anger, more of the remedy that poisoned her life. I walked down to the shore and held the envelope over a small driftwood fire. I watched the paper curl, the sterling name on the return address turning into black ash. I didn't know it yet, but the final closure wasn't in the conviction or the money. It was in the silence. As the last of the letter burned away, I realized that I had spent my life designing buildings meant to touch the sky, thinking that height was a measure of greatness. But Eleanor taught me the truth. Greatness isn't in how high you climb. It's in how deep your roots go into the truth, and how much weight you're willing to carry for the people you love. The structure of my life had failed, but the earth beneath it was finally clear. I looked out at the Atlantic, the waves crashing against the rocks with a rhythmic, eternal power. For the first time in 71 years, I wasn't looking for a crack in the horizon. I was just watching the sunrise. And as the light hit the water, I felt Eleanor's hand on mine, not a ghost, but a memory so strong it felt like a support beam. We were okay. The debt was paid. The foundation was finally, irrevocably, set in stone.